5:47 a.m., June 3rd, 2026, Chula Vista, California. 32 federal agents moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward a beige stucco building on Industrial Court. No sirens, no lights. 7 unmarked SUVs and a single tactical transport rolled to a stop on the cracked asphalt. Doors opened in sequence. Agents fanned out without a word. Estimated value of fraudulent VA disbursements, $58 million. The building sign read Semper Fi Transitional Living Center, licensed by the California Department of Healthcare Services, accredited, inspected. Clean audit reports going back to late 2023. Inside, a medical supply room that hadn't appeared on any floor plan submitted to the VA's Office of Inspector General. Agents had a photograph of what that room contained. None of them needed reminding. This was the first of 11 simultaneous warrant executions across San Diego County. Chula Vista to Escondido, National City to El Cajon. Every facility that bore the name of a veteran rehabilitation center, every building that had claimed to serve America's most vulnerable population, was about to be searched. The operation was called Shelter Game. It had been running for 5 months. What it found would force the VA to rethink every oversight protocol it had built since 2001. Raymond Okafor had been a VA Office of Inspector General auditor for 11 years. He'd reviewed hundreds of grant disbursement files. Most were routine. Facilities submitted patient counts, billed accordingly, received reimbursement. The system ran on trust. The federal government assumed licensed, accredited facilities were reporting honestly. There were spot checks. There were annual audits. But there was no automated cross-referencing between VA occupancy data and county fire marshal permits. That gap is where $58 million went. In November 2025, Okafor was working through a backlog of reimbursement claims when one file stopped him. A facility called Heritage Path Veterans Housing in Escondido had submitted a monthly billing claim listing 340 active residential patients. Okafor pulled the address. He cross-checked it against county records. The building at that address was permitted for a maximum occupancy of 40. He flagged it internally, sat on it overnight. The next morning, he pulled the billing histories for every facility operated by the same LLC umbrella. What he found didn't feel like a clerical error. It felt like a system. He called his supervisor. His supervisor called the Regional VA Inspector General's office in Los Angeles. Within 72 hours, the file had been forwarded to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in San Diego. That was November 14th, 2025. What Okafor couldn't have known, and what it would take 5 months of joint federal investigation to fully map, was that the 340 patient figure wasn't an accounting mistake. It was a number chosen deliberately, high enough to maximize reimbursement, not so high that a casual reviewer would dismiss it. The people running this scheme understood exactly how audits worked. One of them had helped design the state-level oversight protocol 7 years earlier. Here's what most people assume about VA fraud, that it's opportunistic. A facility inflates a few numbers, pockets, some overpayments, gets caught eventually through routine review. Small scale, unsophisticated. The evidence in this case tells a different story. The 11 facilities weren't run by careless administrators. They were components of a single, coordinated financial architecture, designed, built, and maintained to move cartel money through a federal grant pipeline without triggering any of the standard anti-money laundering tripwires. The structure worked like this. At the top level, 11 licensed rehabilitation and transitional housing facilities operated under what appeared to be independent ownership. Each had its own board of directors, its own licensed staff, its own VA certification. On paper, they were separate entities. In practice, all 11 were managed through a shared administrative services contract with a company called Pacific Coast Compliance Group, LLC, registered in Nevada, operating out of a shared office space in Chula Vista's business district. Pacific Coast Compliance Group was owned, through 2 layers of shell companies, by a man named Ernesto Villanueva Reyes. Agents wouldn't connect Villanueva Reyes to the scheme until February 2026. In November and December 2025, the investigation had a simpler focus: figure out where the money was actually going. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit assigned Special Agent Dana Carrillo to lead the financial mapping. Carrillo had spent 6 years tracking trade-based money laundering before joining the San Diego field office. She'd worked cartel finance cases out of El Paso. She understood how large-scale cash movement got disguised as legitimate commerce. What she found in the Pacific Coast Compliance Group's vendor records took 3 weeks to fully reconstruct. The fraudulent VA reimbursements, drawn from ghost patient billings listing names, social security numbers, and treatment dates for veterans who either didn't exist, had died, or had never enrolled in the facility's programs, were deposited into the 11 facilities' operating accounts. From there, funds were swept nightly into 6 LLC accounts. Those LLCs had been registered under social security numbers belonging to deceased veterans. 4 of the veterans whose identities had been used were buried at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery. 2 others had died at VA medical centers in 2023. From the 6 LLC accounts, funds moved outward through a layered system of vendor payments. The primary vendor was a company called MedSup Distributors S.A. de CV, registered in Mexicali, Baja California. On paper, MedSup supplied medical equipment to the 11 facilities: gurneys, examination tables, monitoring equipment, IV infusion systems. The equipment was never delivered. The invoices were fabricated. The payments were real. Between late 2023 and June 2026, $58 million in VA reimbursement funds had been converted to vendor payments and transferred to MedSup Distributors. From Mexicali, the money moved through a series of currency exchange operations into Tijuana. From Tijuana, it entered cartel financial networks through a mechanism that took Carrillo's team until March 2026 to fully trace. I spent hours going through the case file, and one detail kept pulling me back: the sophistication of the identity infrastructure. 6 LLCs. 6 deceased veterans. All 6 social security numbers had been active in the VA system. All 6 had clean records. Whoever set this up didn't grab random numbers. They selected identities that would pass automated validation checks without triggering flags. That level of specificity doesn't come from an improvised criminal finance operation. It comes from someone who understood how the VA's internal database worked. The ATF entered the picture in December 2025. During routine fieldwork connected to the initial VA fraud referral, an ATF agent in San Diego's field office pulled the federal licensing database for businesses operating at the 11 facility addresses. Standard procedure: when a financial fraud investigation touches physical locations, ATF checks for any active or pending federal firearms license applications associated with those addresses. 3 of the 11 facilities had pending FFL applications. Veteran rehabilitation centers don't apply for federal firearms licenses. There's no legitimate operational reason for one. The applications listed the purpose as gunsmithing services for veteran clients, a description that might have passed a casual review but flagged immediately when cross-referenced against the facility's VA certifications, which restricted operations to residential rehabilitation and transitional housing. The ATF notified the FBI's San Diego field office. A joint task force was assembled within the week. Operation Shelter Game formally launched December 18, 2025. The task force included 8 agents from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, 4 ATF special agents, 2 analysts from the VA's Office of Inspector General, and, at a level the task force commander initially considered unusual, a financial analyst embedded into the VA's regional grant processing pipeline. Her name was officially withheld from the operational record. For 5 months, she processed grant applications, approved disbursements, and flagged suspicious patterns internally while feeding real-time data to the investigation's financial mapping team. Her access gave agents something they'd rarely had in a financial fraud case: a live view of money moving through the system as it happened. The first major breakthrough came in January 2026. The task force had been tracking disbursements to the 6 LLC accounts and watching the fund transfers to MedSup Distributors. The volume was consistent, roughly $2 to $3 million per month, moving in chunks small enough to avoid single large transaction flags, but large enough in aggregate to fund significant cartel operations. In January, the pattern changed. A disbursement of $4.2 million hit the 6 LLC accounts over a 4-day period, the largest single movement in the scheme's history. The funds moved to MedSup within 36 hours. 2 days later, an ATF source in Tijuana reported unusual activity at a logistics warehouse near the city's Otay Mesa district, a facility already on ATF's watch list for separate reasons related to firearms trafficking. The task force cross-referenced the timing. The connection couldn't be proven yet, but agents noted it. What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale of the financial fraud, it's the physical infrastructure that ran alongside it. By February 2026, agents understood that the 11 facilities weren't just laundering money. They were also providing a physical logistics layer for cartel operations. The buildings had loading docks. Medical supply deliveries gave cover for other movements. and at least one facility. The Escondido location on Valley Parkway had a medical supply room that appeared on no official floor plan. The obstacle agents faced in February was access. The task force had strong financial evidence. They had the LLC structure mapped. They had the MedSup connection. What they didn't have was visibility into what was physically happening inside the facilities. A search warrant at that stage would tip the scheme and almost certainly end the embedded analyst's access. Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Velde made the call to hold. Keep the financial tracking running. Develop physical surveillance externally. Wait for an organic reason to get inside at least one location without burning the larger operation. That reason arrived in March 2026 from an unexpected direction. An anonymous tip to the California Department of Social Services alleged that a patient at one of the 11 facilities, the National City location operating as Valor Bridge Housing, had been held against his will for 6 days after requesting discharge. The complaint was specific: name of the patient, approximate date, the name of the staff member involved. The task force couldn't ignore a potential victim situation, but they also couldn't allow a standard CDSS investigation to walk into a facility under federal surveillance without advance coordination. Velde spent 2 days working through the bureaucratic structure to get CDSS to route the complaint back through channels that would let the FBI manage the response. The patient, a 62-year-old veteran named Arthur Mendez, had since been discharged. He was located and interviewed. He confirmed the account. He also mentioned, without prompting, that the staff member who had blocked his discharge received a phone call at approximately 2 a.m. on the night in question, after which the facility's entrance had been locked from the inside. 2 a.m. The same window during which, financial records would later show, a $300,000 disbursement had moved from one of the LLC accounts. Mendez's account didn't directly connect to the financial scheme, but it suggested that at least some of the facility's licensed staff knew the buildings were being used for purposes beyond rehabilitation housing. That changed the potential defendant pool. By March 2026, Operation Shelter Game had identified 14 primary subjects. The list included administrative staff from Pacific Coast Compliance Group. It included the registered agents for 4 of the 6 shell LLCs. It included 2 licensed clinical social workers who appeared on multiple facilities' staffing records and whose billing submissions had, in several documented instances, listed treatment sessions for patients their own clinical notes confirmed had never been admitted. And it included retired Army Colonel Daniel Strickland. Strickland was 71 years old. He had served 26 years in the Army, including 2 combat deployments. He'd retired as a colonel and moved into nonprofit work, specifically veterans advocacy. In 2023, he had been recruited to serve as board chair for the nonprofit umbrella organization that nominally oversaw 6 of the 11 facilities. His name appeared on VA grant applications. His signature authorized quarterly disbursement requests. He had attended, according to event records, 4 charity galas on behalf of the organization. Galas that had raised an additional $2.3 million in private donations, the disposition of which was still under review at the time of the arrests. Consider what it meant for the agents who had to look at Daniel Strickland's service record and then look at what his signature had authorized. 26 years, 2 deployments, a veteran who had made veterans his post-service mission. And somewhere along the way, whether through financial pressure, coercion, or deliberate choice, he had signed documents that facilitated the theft of money meant for the people he said he was there to serve. The investigation's second major complication came in April 2026. Carrillo's financial mapping had traced the MedSup payments forward from Mexicali. The money moved through 3 currency exchange operations, all legitimate businesses, all licensed, all apparently unaware of the full picture, into Tijuana. From Tijuana, agents had identified 2 primary cartel-linked financial intermediaries. But in April, a third transfer channel emerged, smaller, roughly 8% of total volume, and it ran not toward Tijuana, but toward a series of accounts in the Cayman Islands. The account holders were shell companies. 2 of them shared a registered agent with a private equity firm based in Phoenix, Arizona. The Phoenix connection fell outside Operation Shelter Game's geographic jurisdiction. Velde notified FBI headquarters. A separate investigative thread was opened. As of the June 3rd raids, that thread was still active. The Phoenix dimension remains under investigation. The most important thing about this case isn't the $58 million. It's what the scheme reveals about a structural vulnerability nobody had previously identified. VA grant processing and ATF federal firearms licensing databases do not cross-reference each other. There is no automated flag when a VA-funded facility applies for an FFL. There is no system that compares a facility's claimed patient population against county fire marshal occupancy permits. The oversight infrastructure was designed with reasonable care for a world in which fraud operated at the scale it had historically operated. What Villanueva Reyes and the people working with him understood was that the VA systems were calibrated for small-scale abuse. Nobody had built a tripwire for a $58 million coordinated operation. Here's the take that'll probably get us some pushback. The VA isn't primarily to blame for this. The oversight gap existed because Congress hadn't funded the cross-agency data integration that would have caught this scheme within months of its launch. The VA OIG had flagged the need for VA to ATF database coordination in a 2022 report. That report sat in a committee. The funding was never appropriated. Raymond Okafor caught this case because he was doing his job carefully on a Tuesday in November. He shouldn't have been the last line of defense. On May 19th, 2026, the task force received intelligence that changed the timeline. A source with access to Pacific Coast Compliance Group's internal communications reported that Villanueva Reyes had become aware of unusual activity in the VA grant processing pipeline. He hadn't identified the embedded analyst, but he had noticed that several reimbursement approvals were taking longer than normal. He was asking questions internally. Velde convened an emergency review. The task force had a choice: continue the operation and risk losing access as Villanueva Reyes tightened internal security, or move toward execution before the scheme could be wound down. The problem was physical evidence. Financial records established the fraud and the money movement, but without physical corroboration, without evidence recovered from inside the facilities. Prosecutors worried that defense attorneys could argue the financial irregularities were accounting errors, not criminal intent. The task force knew from surveillance and intelligence that the Escondido facility's undocumented medical supply room contained something. They didn't know exactly what. Moving early meant going in without complete intelligence on what agents would find. Velde made the call. June 3rd. All 11 simultaneous. Agents worked backward from available floor plans, aerial surveillance, and what intelligence they had on the Escondido facility's interior layout. 16 hours before the operation, a piece of information came through that proved accurate. The medical supply room was accessible from a secondary corridor connecting to the building's loading dock, not from the main patient areas. The tactical plan was adjusted accordingly. There's a line in the operational planning document that reads almost like fiction. Entry team designated to secondary corridor should anticipate possible secondary locked door at junction point and should prepare breach equipment accordingly. Standard language. Bureaucratic phrasing. What it meant in practice was that the agents going into that corridor knew they might find something significant and weren't certain what it was. At 5:47 a.m. on June 3rd, 2026, 32 agents moved toward the Chula Vista facility. At the same moment, coordinated by a joint operations center at the FBI's San Diego field office, teams executed simultaneous warrants at the 10 remaining locations across the county. The Chula Vista entry took 4 minutes. Agents secured the administrative area, identified and detained 2 staff members present at that hour, and began a systematic search. The administrative offices yielded document files that corroborated the LLC structure and billing records the task force had already mapped. At the National City location, Valor Bridge Housing, agents found a secondary office with a locked filing cabinet. Inside, paper records of cash transactions totaling approximately $800,000, denominated in amounts consistent with the scheme's known cash layering patterns. The filing cabinet had a combination lock. The combination was written on a sticky note on the inside of a desk drawer. At the El Cajon facility, agents encountered something unexpected. The building's maintenance room contained a secondary electrical panel powering a section of the basement not reflected on any submitted floor plan. The basement section was accessible through a locked door in the maintenance room. Inside, commercial-grade paper shredding equipment and a collection of hard drives, some showing evidence of recent wiping. At the Escondido location, on Valley Parkway, the entry team moved through the secondary corridor at 5:52 a.m. They found the locked door the operational plan had anticipated. Breach took under 30 seconds. 140 pounds of fentanyl. Packaged in sealed medical supply containers, stacked on industrial shelving alongside legitimate medical equipment. The containers were labeled with product codes from MedSup distributors. Each had a corresponding invoice in a binder on the shelving unit. Invoices for medical equipment the facilities had supposedly received and were supposedly using. The fentanyl wasn't what Operation Shelter Game had originally been designed to find. The task force had mapped a money laundering operation. What the Escondido storage room suggested was that the cartel's relationship with the 11 facilities went beyond financial services. The facilities were apparently also providing physical storage, a secure distribution point for narcotics moving north from Tijuana. Agents later characterized the fentanyl as what one described as the rent, the cartel's payment to Villanueva Reyes and his network for access to the laundering infrastructure. Whether that characterization holds up is a matter for federal prosecutors and the eventual trial. What do you think? Did the federal oversight system fail these veterans? Or was this the kind of scheme that no reasonable system could have caught before Okafor spotted that number? By 7:30 a.m., all 11 facilities were secured. 14 individuals were in custody. The coordination had held. No subjects had been tipped in advance. Among those arrested, 2 licensed clinical social workers, Marcus Trujillo and Jennifer Sarabia, both with active and unrestricted professional licenses at the time of arrest. A Pacific Coast Compliance Group financial manager named Kevin Cho, who had processed disbursements to the 6 LLC accounts for 18 months. 3 individuals associated with the registered agent network used to establish the shell companies. A logistics coordinator named Hector Ruiz Mendoza, arrested not at a facility, but at the Otay Mesa port of entry, crossing into the United States from Tijuana with $380,000 in cashier's checks issued by 4 different Tijuana financial institutions, and Daniel Strickland, arrested at his home in Rancho Bernardo at 6:15 a.m. He answered the door in civilian clothes. He was, by agent accounts, not surprised. Ernesto Villanueva Reyes was not among those arrested on June 3rd. Intelligence indicated he had been in Tijuana in the days leading up to the operation. Whether he had advance warning, whether the delays in grant processing in May had given him enough concern to relocate, remained unclear as of the date of the arrests. A federal arrest warrant was issued. Extradition proceedings were initiated through official channels with Mexican federal authorities. As of July 2026, Villanueva Reyes had not been located. The federal complaint filed June 3rd listed charges against all 14 arrested individuals: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering conspiracy, identity theft in connection with federal programs, and, for those associated with the Escondido location, conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute a controlled substance. Daniel Strickland's defense attorney issued a statement the morning of the arrest. It said his client had served his country with honor and had participated in the organization in a board capacity, relying on representations made by administrative staff regarding the organization's activities. The VA's response was institutional and measured, a statement noting that the department took all allegations of grant fraud seriously and was conducting a comprehensive review of oversight protocols. The California Department of Healthcare Services suspended the operating licenses of all 11 facilities effective June 3rd. Patients at facilities with actual residential populations. There were some, though significantly fewer than the billing records claimed, were transferred to other licensed programs in the county. The exact number of real patients who had been using the facilities for legitimate services and whose treatment was disrupted by the closures remains unclear. Something about that detail doesn't sit right. The scheme used veterans as cover. The facilities were nominally designed to serve people who had served the country. And in some cases, in the margins of a $58 million criminal operation, actual veterans may have been receiving actual services in those buildings. What happens to them gets a single line in a press release. The 140 pounds of fentanyl recovered from the Escondido facility represented, at street distribution value, an estimated $12 million in narcotics. Laboratory analysis confirmed the substance and its purity, high enough to suggest it had not yet been cut for retail distribution. The cartel supply chain that delivered it to the Escondido storage room, and that had been using the facility for an unknown period prior to June 3rd, was disrupted but not dismantled. The Otay Mesa crossing remained operational. The Tijuana logistics infrastructure that the money laundering scheme had fed into remained operational. The demand for both laundering services and narcotics distribution infrastructure remained, as it always does, unchanged. We'll say what most won't. The $58 million matters less than the 340. That number, a building permitted for 40 patients, billing for 340. That's the number that should have been caught automatically, programmatically, without requiring one careful auditor on a Tuesday afternoon. The VA and ATF have been asked, at various points, to build the cross-referencing infrastructure that would catch that discrepancy. The request has been pending for years. This case is what a pending request costs. Will we see another scheme like this before the databases are actually integrated? Comment why yes or no. Ruiz Mendoza, the logistics coordinator arrested at Otay Mesa, was held on a federal material witness warrant in addition to the substantive charges. His cooperation status, whether he was talking to prosecutors, what he knew about the broader cartel network, whether his knowledge extended beyond the money movement functions he appeared to have served, was not publicly disclosed as of the filing date. The Phoenix thread. The 8% of laundered funds that had moved toward Cayman-registered entities with apparent connections to an Arizona private equity firm remained an open investigative matter. No charges had been filed in connection with that dimension of the scheme. 4 of the 14 arrested subjects had entered preliminary cooperation discussions with prosecutors by late June 2026. The terms of any cooperation agreements were sealed. The 6 LLC accounts had a combined remaining balance of approximately $2.1 million at the time of seizure. Federal forfeiture proceedings were initiated. The remaining $56 million in disbursements, already moved through MedSup distributors and into the Tijuana financial network, was not recovered. International asset recovery proceedings typically take years. In cases involving cartel-linked financial infrastructure in Mexico, they more often produce no recovery at all. Subscribe if you want to follow Operation Shelter Game as the case develops. There are threads here that aren't finished. The Semper Fi Transitional Living Center in Chula Vista has a parking lot, weeds growing through the asphalt, a sign still mounted above the entrance, the California licensing suspension notice taped to the door. Somewhere in the financial records recovered from that building, there are names. Veterans listed as active patients. Veterans whose social security numbers were used without their knowledge. Veterans whose identities became line items in a federal grant claim for a building they never entered. Most of those names will become evidence. They will not become headlines. The scheme is dismantled. The vulnerability that made it possible is still being reviewed by a committee. The man who built the financial architecture is in Tijuana, or somewhere connected to it, and there is a warrant with his name on it that has not yet produced an arrest. The 140 pounds of fentanyl is in a federal evidence facility in San Diego. The demand for what it represented is not.